So when I was at the ETC, I focused on cloud and how we get to the cloud and working with all these different organizations. And so I had a wonderful opportunity to engage with all of the major cloud vendors and other key partners in that. And I think that if you're really building a long-term strategy, you're going to be looking at multi-cloud, or you're going to be looking at creating a data neutrality model or other things. But I just think that these are some great folks to hear some of this point of view, and Bob's really been trying to champion a different way to look at things. So I'd really like to hand that off to you, Bob.
A different way, I like that. So thanks, Erik. When Erik asked me to do this, he first proposed a couple topics that I totally was not qualified to do. So he turned to me and said, well, what would you like to do? And I said, as a lot of, I know a lot of people in the room, but as a lot of you know, Technicolor buys an incredible millions of dollars a month of services from the cloud providers. And so, well, I'd like to talk about my two biggest dilemmas and our two biggest dilemmas as we talk about the cloud environment, and really put it to the vendors and some agnostic folks like Chuck and Erik to answer some tough questions that I still face and that we all face. So I'm excited about this. We had a great conversation before this, so I hope the conversation is as good today as it was on the phone. So why don't we go down the line, and you guys, I'm Bob, I'm CTO for Technicolor, and just kind of tell us a little bit more about you and what you do.
Sure. My name is Chuck Parker. I'm the CEO at Sohonet. We're a large private network with a bunch of sort of connectivity and collaboration services layered on top for production.
I'm Buzz Hayes. I'm a recovering producer and solutions architect here at Google Cloud.
Joel Sloss, a program manager for Microsoft Azure. A lot of my focus is on secure production workflows.
Erik Weaver, focused on kind of special projects right now at the ETC.
So the two topics I want to talk about today, and my timer here says 13 minutes. I don't think that's right.
The one down there, 37.
Oh, down there? Okay, got it. Okay, perfect. Great. So two topics. One is, you've heard about this for years. We still don't know when it's going to happen and how it's going to happen. The first one is Studio in the cloud. Where are we with it, and how far is it going to go? And the second thing is to talk about multi-cloud. To what extent do people like me and Technicolor and other buyers of services need to be multi-cloud, versus should we put all our eggs in one basket with one provider or somewhere in the middle? So let's start with Studio in the cloud. And I'd like to start by posing the question to Google and Microsoft first, which is, so there's this idea floating around that you can do everything in the cloud one of these days, and that there will be a studio in the cloud, and you can open up a studio anywhere in the world, log on, create your technical infrastructure, and start producing a movie, a television show, advertising, game, all forms of VR, AR, all forms of entertainment. So where do you think we are today? And do you think we're ever going to get all the way to the end where we don't need a technical infrastructure in our facilities? So Buzz, why don't we start with
Sure. To answer part of your question, yes, I think it's possible, although we're not there yet, and it's for a bunch of reasons I think we're not there yet. But the ultimate goal is that, at least putting my producer hat on for a second, I always want people who are on the clock to be creative while they're on the clock, and on the clock should not include looking at progress bars of any kind, really. And that seems to be the majority of what happens. I had the luxury of growing up in the film world, where we shot film, we edited film, and as cumbersome as it might sound to people who've never done it before, it was far more immediate than anything we have going right now. Digital makes our lives easier, but it also makes it far more cumbersome. So the process is, if we just rethink this a little bit about how long should it take for these assets to make it to whoever needs it next, and what are those requirements they have for what access they do have, what vendors do we have. If we can keep that in a ecosystem where it's all in one place and people have what they need, then I think what we've really done in a funny way is recreated the old studio system where all the departments are in one place, where everything is accountable to one place, and then you're basically granting access to those things with the people you like to work with. So the benefit, as far as I'm concerned, about moving to a full cloud solution is that you get to work with the people you like to work with wherever they are. But as I mentioned, there's a lot of impediments to getting there. So I think there's a lot of people that are willing to do that. But some of these, what would be considered baby steps in the cloud world, for example, burst rendering is a big thing in visual effects. I don't think that's a stepping stone into a virtual studio environment at all, because all that does is acknowledge that you have an on-prem facility and, oh, it's not quite big enough. It's not really acknowledging the power of the cloud. So once we get past that sort of thinking, I think we'll start to realize that there's a path to get there, but it's going to take a little while.
So it sounds like on the spectrum you still believe the original vision that we can put most of it there is real, if I
Yes,
could
I
paraphrase.
Absolutely.
Joel, how about Microsoft?
So I think we're a little bit in between, the immediacy that you have with the film world and the ultimate promise of cloud. Eventually, we'll get to a point where it's ubiquitous with the storage and the compute, but there are, like you said, there are a couple of blocking factors right now, and I think it's very dependent on the kind of production and the kind of content being developed and where that's happening. Because as we move to much higher resolution, higher frame rates, just the sheer volume of content that's being created, it's to be able to do that at all, you have to have some infrastructure on site. So you're going to be in that hybrid model, and then like with burst rendering, and some forms of editorial and other elements that can be moved into the cloud, you're going to see that spectrum. But if you consider, you're shooting in a remote location and you're just generating terabytes and terabytes every day, you don't have the network connectivity to move that back to a central location. If you have any connectivity at all, it's still not going to be able to move that kind of content into a central repository. So you're going to have some storage. You're going to have some local compute, just to be able to get that immediacy and have producers looking at it, have the director looking at it. So hopefully, maybe 5G is going to help us solve that problem. But even for that, are you going to have 5G in the middle of the African savannah, where you're filming your next nature show? So
the way it's going, we may have it there before we have it here. We're a little bit behind. So thank you for this. So it sounds like you're a little bit more on the skeptical side of we're still going to need some hardware close to the actual.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's skepticism. I say it's time frame of being able to get there.
Got it. So, Chuck, I know you had a different perspective on this, a little bit different during our conversation. So,
Sure. But I guess let me give you guys some examples of where we are today, what the impediments are, and where I think the trends are headed. So first of all, I'm not going to say cloud studio or studio in the cloud, because that encompasses a very big vision. But I'm going to use a phrase that's cloud-first workflows, right? So I think we're starting to see the beginnings of that. To Buzz's point, rendering in the cloud for peak probably started in 2015 at scale, and now is we're starting to see people who are rendering entire either features, commercials. But we have some evidence. If you guys haven't heard of Untold Studios out of the UK. A good example of four guys doing a startup, taking a stub-end lease in Soho, and doing everything virtually, meaning virtual workstations. So they essentially had KVM or keyboard, video, and mouse on-prem, no on-prem storage, no on-prem compute. Spun the entire team up with freelancers. Did what is largely a visual effects workflow for a customer, and then when it was over, spun it back down. And that's a small example. It's not a company the size of Technicolor or MPC or the Mill, but it's an interesting data point early in the cloud-first workflow. I think what's holding back customers today is a couple things. Egress costs, right? I don't think we're going to see studio in the cloud unless egress gets solved either by some of the startup players who are trying to get in there, so the Wasabis and our stores of the world, or one of the big guys, makes a change, right? But if you think about what's driving from trends. So if you look over the next 5 or 10 years that Bob was saying, I think there's a couple things to think about. One is tax credits aren't going to change, right? We're going to continue to have people in far-flung places at the last minute. The good news for that is the rise of connectivity at sort of, I'm going to say broadcast quality rates is pretty standard now in most first world nations. And the ability to do real-time collaboration because of that is a thing, right? Where, to Buzz's point, you can work with the people you want to work with regardless of where they are, although regardless maybe they have to be in a tax-friendly location based on where the production's going to shoot, right? That, coupled with sort of the rise of the freelance revolution that continues to happen, right? So, the ad community would tell us we're all insane that they've had almost all freelancers for a very long time. I think you're going to start seeing that, just like the Untold Studios example I gave a minute ago. You'll start seeing a lot more freelancers the way we view a colorist or an editor today, right? You may employ a colorist, but often a director or a producer wants to work with a specific person. And as they get more talented, Company 3 has an entire company built around somebody, or at least originally did. You're going to start seeing that kind of capability happen to those talented creatives beyond production, so into post and visual effects, which means big companies, if they're going to really deploy a studio in the cloud, they're going to have to start thinking about talent inventories, right? So how do I pull together 150 people on a show or 50 people on a show the way a production does today, right? But do that in post or visual effects. So I think the building blocks are there. The trends are heading in the right direction. Probably the early tactical limiter is egress, right? And that's what's making it very hard for people to work with somebody on transcoding and a different person on storage and a different person on rendering.
So it sounds like a little bit more toward the we can do it all in the cloud, but there's a lot left to do to make it happen.
Absolutely.
Got it. So Erik, I think we've heard both ends of the spectrum. Why don't you bring it home for us?
So I think maybe I might go, if I could do 60-60, I don't know how you'd say that, but I definitely think that you're facing these challenges of, as soon as we figure out the bandwidth or constrictions or some of these things with some of the problems, we come out with a new camera. We come out with the new UHD or a 6K now. And I think that that's going to continue to grow. It's going to continue to challenge the process through the whole thing. But there are mitigating ways to deal with some of that. But you will have to have NVMe or NVMe over Fabric or this next generation of storage technologies to deal with 16-bit color depth, on up to what I think Azure now does 32K, I think, in the new system. I can't remember exactly. But you're going to have some right there processing just to deal with that, because even if you're using a proxy, that's a lot of data right there. But on the opposite side, I think that the reason it is going to go towards the clouds is because what you're going to see is a trend towards neutral data exchanges, places in which people congregate and transfer access to work on common projects together. That's absolutely the future, in my opinion. It probably is not next year, but that's where we're going towards, where you basically go to, since if we cannot get the egress fees drop from a major cloud provider, you're simply going to go to someone like an Equinix. You're going to set up an IOA exchange point or an interconnected oriented architecture exchange point. You're going to drop storage there. They're going to put layers of the security and everything else over the top of that, and you're just going to trade data within them to deal with these different shots and different pieces, and then give permission to move stuff. So I think that the ecosystem is what's going to be critical to make everything move forward in the future, and I think that has to come because also of the file sizes.
So a lot of you have probably seen already, there's a paper, if you haven't seen this already, you should Google it and get a hold of it. MovieLabs is a consortium of the major studios who got together and did just this. They looked ahead 10 years and they said, what is this all going to look like? So they just published their paper last week. If you haven't seen it, MovieLabs, Google it, or Microsoft it, Bing it, I shouldn't. So look for it, and trust me, you should read it, because the studios have taken positions on a lot of major issues that are going to impact this. And that kind of brings one more related question to this, Erik, and thanks for bringing this up, is So who's going to do that? Who is going to come up with the standards and the architecture to do something like this? Do you think it's going to be one of the cloud providers? Is there another consortium that we need to put together to design this ecosystem so that we can all be going after data and applications in the same place? Is it somebody like Technicolor? I mean, who's going to do this?
I think the leadership level needs to start with a combination of ETC and MovieLabs. Why? Because these organizations are all the CTOs of the biggest firms. And what we found traditionally works really well in things like IMF or these other standard processes is we get it started in the right way. We kind of put this kind of core set of leadership down and people who can contribute to it, kind of give an 80%, 70, 80% of the way their definition, and then hand it off to the SMPTEs and the other people to polish certain aspects. But I think it has to come from the leadership of the studios. And at that point, get the buy-in of either the clouds or the Technicolors or the other folks, or you're actually on the board of the ETC. But I think that's where the leadership has to start.
Okay, but somebody's actually going to have to do the work, right, of pulling this together. So
Yeah,
I
but,
think we're
but
still.
look, when you look at digital cinema, though, that's exactly what the groups
Yes,
did.
yes, yes.
They got together, they got a facility, and they worked on it together as a group. And it was not a cheap or free endeavor.
No, and it was amazing that they were able to come to an agreement with all the different varying interests when that happened. So let it be said here today, we're going to need a group like that to help make this happen. Anybody else have a perspective on this? How is this going to happen?
Yeah, I was just going to pile on to Erik there that, yes, I think a certain amount of leadership has to come from the content community, but, and I wasn't in the industry when a lot of that kind of stuff was being defined, but it feels like that it's a more complex scenario now because there are so many more digital entities that are out there. So many ISVs, so many partner companies, and all of them, have this input. And we're seeing a manifestation of that as we look at, even security standards of how do you get everybody, into the same spot and get them thinking about what's going to be the best common way to do it. And you start looking at content standards or naming conventions, and I think there are good efforts out there like IDER that are helping to drive that. But every ISV, every service provider has like, no, we've got the best way of doing that. How do you get them into the room?
Mm-hmm. So I'd actually like to give the opposite caveat. I've seen a lot of the studio executives take traditional engineers and say, build a cloud solution. And that's not their expertise. That's not where they came from and what they did. And you're kind of scratching your head saying, you don't understand this and this. These are fundamental principles of how you're changing. You don't just lift and shift your environment and the way you're doing things now into a cloud environment. You're not going to get any of the rewards here. You're going to have a lot of problems. So I do think that there has to be intelligence from the broader community of experts.
I agree. Sorry. What's interesting when you read the MovieLabs thing, it's very insightful. But one of the basic concepts in there is that we would now be bringing the applications to the data. The data is in a central repository. It kind of makes conceptual sense to everybody. But what they cover in fairly extensive detail and why this is such a long-term plan is because all of the little pieces in order to enable this to happen involve things that most people never think about when it comes to moving things to cloud. So what's interesting is in some ways I think because we have so many snowflake workflows in the world that in order to fully adopt this idea of a studio in the cloud, it's almost as if the studios of the world, the Disneys, the Netflix, whoever, need to be able to package these workflows in some templated way that can be easily deployed that they then hand to their vendors. Because one of the issues we're going to have is all of these third-party vendors that work on things, if they have their own unique workflows, half of the battle is just getting all of that stuff compliant with blob storage and connectivity and all these other things. And if the studios were handing out this virtual version of their studio to the vendors that they work with, then that enables this in a far broader scale than what we would currently be running up against.
I think the elephant in the room is it's production, right? So while everybody in this room probably would love to have the perfect cloud reference architecture, and you might slot different vendors in different places, the guys not in the room right now are the guys who are making movies, right? So Buzz, you were in that production world before. Nobody starts their next feature and says, hey, during this feature, I want to try 5 new workflows. Yeah. Nobody does, right? So the challenge we have is you need that, let's call that reference architecture, right? But every studio CTO or frankly, production supervisor and post supervisor needs to have their own version of what that reference architecture is for them and how they make content. And there needs to be some flexibility, right? So to steal a phrase from Craig German, this concept of a flexible reference architecture, meaning, hey, I'm going to make movies for the next 10 years, and over that 10 years, things are going to change, and I have to manage two things. One, evolving my workflow, and two, making the goddamn movie, right? Because a producer or a director are not going to get fired for not using cloud. They will get fired if the movie doesn't go well. I mean, it's that simple. So their incentives are anywhere near having a better workflow.
So I think that's an example of the chasm, you know. And I think when you're talking about it from the angle of Buzz here, they're looking for kind of that binary level that says, how do we commonly identify assets? How do we construct assets together? Just different things. You know, there's these fundamental building blocks. And on the opposite side, they're talking about workflows, and they don't even always have an engineer who's setting up a common workflow on a production. They're just getting it done and, you know, might have some help from somebody at a senior level, but big chasm there.
Got it. Well, so I want to move to the second topic here, but it sounds like the broad consensus here is it's happening. There's probably pieces of it that are going to remain local, but studio in the cloud is going to happen. And, you know, you brought up the example of Untold Studios. I guess what I'd add to this is for those of us who are in the business already, we're going to have to watch it because there are a lot of these smaller players that are going to, while we're sitting here debating whether or not it's going to happen, they're going to be finding the tools out there and competing with us. And in fact, Untold Studios has already competed with Technicolor on a bid, and they don't have a lot of technical infrastructure. Now, they've had, of course, the usual startup issues, but I think for us who provide these services in the industry, this could happen in some places maybe unexpectedly faster than we think, and the barriers, I think, eventually are going to get resolved. So let's move on to our other topic, or I do want to leave some time for questions. So the whole idea of multi-cloud, of people like Technicolor and Deluxe, and even the smaller studios are today faced with decisions about, do we go with Azure? Do we go with Google? Do we go with Amazon? Should we do business with all three of them? Should we partner with one or do a couple of partnerships? Should we remain 100% agnostic? So I'd like to start again with the two vendors and just ask you, you know, what's your position on this? And if your position is that multi-cloud is an option that you should support, what specifically are you willing to do to make it easier to do business with your competitor? And I know that's a tough question, but if it's multi-cloud, that means that when I go to pick render horsepower or storage for my facilities, that in some senses, at least that piece of it becomes a commodity. So where do you guys stand on this? And Joel, would you like to start?
Sure. What's interesting is that there's desire versus reality. Of course, we would want everybody to say Azure is awesome. We want to do all of our stuff in there, but the reality is that the workflows don't support that today, and unfortunately for ISVs and solution providers, in a lot of cases they do have to pick a horse because it's really difficult to support multiple different clouds with multiple different APIs and and different implementations of standards. I think ideally, for a customer, they'd be able to seamlessly bridge between the clouds. They'd be able to have a common data interchange. To be able to support that, the cloud vendors have to work together to and to create these standard conventions that are going to be able to bridge that kind of an environment. I probably can't solve that in this room, but there needs to be some additional collaboration.
Yeah, and to expand on that, I think one of the things that we've been working on a lot at a very fundamental level at Cloud is the understanding that it is a multi-cloud world, and how do you make it a seamless experience for whoever the user is on that. But we also recognize that, let's say, for example, you do have resources in multiple clouds. How do you provide accurate analytics across all those things so that you don't have people monitoring different sites for different data and then trying to parse that data to see if there's commonality? So one of the things that we've been working on is, knowing that we're headed into this multi-cloud world, is providing the analytics across all of the clouds from one place, because we see that as a huge pain point when you are dealing with these. And it also depends on what services you're using too. I mean, it's really easy right now to pick cloud storage in any provider and find some way to connect to that storage and move stuff around, and it's not really rocket science. But when you start talking about compute and some of the more elaborate functionality, then that's where the portability aspect of it gets a little broken. But at a fundamental level, if you're looking at application development, where you're trying to be cloud native and using containerized applications or microservices, then if you design that with portability in mind, then it makes the whole thing a lot easier later when you start to shuffle things around. And it helps people who are afraid of vendor lock-in, which is one reason why you might be concerned. The other is price competitiveness. But based on some earlier conversations we've had with vendors, it's also, I mean, you saw this in the press recently, I think, when iPhone users were outraged to find out that their cloud storage wasn't actually on an Apple server, but it happened to be on somebody else's. And I'm thinking, why do you care? That just seems sort of silly, because the user experience is what it is, and the storage could be wherever it is. And I think we need to think a little bit more along those lines. It is an open world.
So it sounds like your position on this is not only do you support it, but you're actively developing tools that will enable your, can I put it that way, to enable your
Absolutely.
Competition?
Absolutely. Well, and part of it too is we still, as much as I'm personally not a huge fan of compute on-prem, we're also enabling as part of that ecosystem, that it's multiple cloud, and there's probably some hybrid stuff going on too. So we want to be able to reach into that and get, because again, as a producer, I just need to know day to day. When somebody says, where are we on this thing? I need to know. And there's so many places to look for information that isn't presented in a common way, and we just need to be able to provide those things. So that's something we're taking very seriously.
So back to the paper, the MovieLabs paper, one of the core concepts again is bring the applications to the data. Well, that kind of brings the question up as, well, where is that data? Is it in one of these providers, or can we find a way to store data in all three providers where it's still reasonably accessible, and so the application can go to the data even though it's in multiple locations? I don't expect you to answer that question right now, but that's a really tough one. Chuck, any perspective on this one?
Yeah, I think if you go back to two concepts, your I'm going to call data gravity, where you're trying to bring applications to the data, and where we are right this minute in our evolution, let's say, in the industry. Today, nobody's doing a full-on cloud-first workflow from production because of the price, right? In other words, it doesn't cost a lot of money to put camera raw into any cloud provider. It's just you can't do anything with it because of the cost of taking a transcode out or VFX plating or anything else, right? I think today's data gravity starts at the edge, i.e. where the productions are. If you go to a Video Village in any of these big productions, they have a shit ton of on-prem storage. Mm-hmm. The second place that data moves to is the mothership. It goes back, frankly, to Burbank, right? So there's a ton of on-prem storage there. They might be afraid of vendor lock-in. They might be afraid of security and everything else, but the reality is economics drive those two choices today. And I don't think you're going to get to a real multi-cloud strategy either until something like Bob was describing, where you can make it cheap enough to put camera raw into all your partner cloud flows, because then you don't have the problem. But then you have to change your workflow to start every capability from camera raw. Or you need egress to change, even if it doesn't go to zero from the big guys. Maybe there's a different view that if you pull out the camera raw, I want to charge you differently than if you're looking at a proxy of it. Somehow you got to be able to see a real-time output view from what you're doing. You can't edit in the cloud with Avid and MS and Azure if you can't look at live output at 444 12-bit, and that's expensive. So something has to give there, or the evolution is just going to take a lot longer than we all would like.
I think part of that is also we're constantly looking at what the definition of egress actually means, because when you're in a production, especially a complicated visual effects production, that thing could theoretically be in production for 3 years or more. So those assets need to be live, and there's not a lot of predictability in that world. You don't know today what you necessarily need tomorrow, let alone today. So you pretty much have to have everything hot. So we're constantly looking at this idea of how do you define egress when, in the grand scheme of things, if you think of it from the virtual studio side that Bob mentioned, egress, in my opinion, is when it leaves the studio, not when it leaves a function to pass on to another function when it hasn't actually been completed yet. So part of that is just the conversation of what that means. And some of this is that we have adopted a technology that was designed for other things. You know, financial institutions use it. Scientific applications are making great use of cloud. And they have a completely different cost structure involved. And egress isn't necessarily such a thing. So we have adopted a thing that isn't the best fit. And so now it's up to us as providers to listen to what people say and then come up with something that does work. Much like we're trying to redefine the meaning of ingress because it comes from many different places.
Good,
Well,
good. Go ahead.
I say that there's also that chicken and egg problem in that you want to get to a point where you've got your whole studio operation in the cloud, but to get there, you have to be able to have your whole studio operation in the cloud. So you're caught between, when are these tools going to be available, and when are people going to be able to do everything, all the compute, all of the editorial, all of your previs and rendering all in one place. But it's you're blocked in being able to to have all of your data in one place unfortunately, by being able to get your data into that one place. I don't know if that makes
But
any sense.
I think what you're also trying to talk about is data sprawl here. So how do you abstract, or how do you understand exactly where all your data is and what you have and where it is, so that you can better orchestrate a hybrid workflow of some sort, or you can marry that to a proxy or something else so you can work more efficiently. And I think that's exactly what we were trying to address with C4 is here's a unique identifier that anybody could run this mathematical problem on, get the same answer, and therefore you know where all your resources on anything that you're indexing, any machine, any cloud, any bucket, anything you want to do. So that goes into your data sovereignty model, where you're understanding all of that, so you can better orchestrate it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, well, just to so I think that in some of these other industries, they're not trying to get as much, or the volume of data out of the cloud again because they are completely digital native. So I think that's an advantage that perhaps that someone like Netflix has, is that they're not trying to move stuff back and forth because everything can exist in a single place. They don't have to do package distribution to a theater. They don't have to move stuff from their studio facility to remote locations because they can house all of that in one place. Not every studio, and certainly the smaller production companies out there can do that. So there's that conflict between the way that the infrastructure has been designed for every other industry and being able to move this historical workflow into that.
Sure, and I think kind of bringing this back to big consumers like Technicolor and our peers, that what we face right now is, number one, we've got the new kids on the block, the Netflix and Untold Studios, who don't really have a legacy and don't really have a large infrastructure that's already deployed to do these businesses. But it's really up to us. And when I get a proposal to buy a bunch of equipment, I have to now compare that with the cost of using the cloud. So one challenge I always give to the big providers, to Amazon, Google, and Microsoft and others, is the reality of somebody like me. When I propose something to our company to spend money in the cloud instead of on-prem, I have to go through a pretty sophisticated financial analysis to show that it really is cheaper in the long run to do it in the cloud. And this is where what you guys are bringing up here calls for a continued close dialogue between us, the large providers, and you, to figure out how can you make the story so that when I go to the board and ask for money to do something, I have a good story, that it's not going to be more expensive. And So I don't think we have all the answers yet, but I think this type of dialogue is what needs to continue. So with that, we have about 5 minutes left. Lots of good points of view here, and thank you guys for both taking some positions, the two major providers, and for providing the agnostic kind of unbiased view from the outside to Chuck and Erik. So we have about 5 minutes left. Two topics again: studio on the cloud and multi-vendor. So any questions?